Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello guys, and welcome back to episode 85 of True Drew Podcast. My name is Avery, and today we're going to be discussing the book, The Sinister Omen. But before we jump into that, I want to tell you guys something. It's not super important or anything, but I think it was in the episode that I did on Mystery of Lilac Inn, which is book number 4, so this would have been way back when I first started the podcast. I remember criticizing a food choice that Nancy made in that book. She had cream of chicken on toast, and I actually had that for dinner yesterday, and I have to say it is pretty tasty. So I guess the moral of the story is don't knock something until you try it. But I don't know, like growing up, I was a kid that lived in a chicken noodle soup household. Like we would eat chicken noodle soup, but my mom would get like cream of chicken and cream of mushroom, and she would be like, this is for casseroles, or we put this in other things. So like for some reason I just couldn't wrap my brain around that. I was like, that's not soup, that's not, you put that in something else. But no, it's actually pretty good by itself. I take back everything I said in that other episode. It slaps. It's a pretty good meal. Anyways, just a random thing I wanted to share. But today we're going to be talking about book number 67, The Sinister Omen, and it was first released in 1982. So in this book, Nancy actually goes to Florida, and this is not the first time she's done this. She went to Florida in Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion, at least in the revised text. I haven't read the original yet, but that was a wild book. If you want a really weird episode, go back and listen to the episode on Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion. But Nancy also went to Florida in the Mystery of Crocodile Island, but this time she's in Fort Lauderdale, and this mystery isn't as crazy as both of those mysteries, but I still just was like, oh, okay, cool. We get to go to Florida. That's fun. I don't know. A part of me was like, Nancy goes to so many exotic locations, and whenever she goes somewhere that I've actually been in real life, I get really excited because I'm like, am I Nancy Drew? Like, I've been to Florida. Nancy's going to Florida. Like, granted, she does different things when she goes to Florida. She solves mysteries and she busts crime rings. I just lay on the beach and go to thrift stores, but to each their own. But I do have to say the motivation for the criminals in this book, it kind of reminded me of Mystery of Crocodile Island because they were smuggling high-tech cameras in that book, and I was like, nobody would go to this much length. I mean, maybe in the 70s they would have been really excited to get some high-tech cameras and they would have used submarines, but it was a little bit far-fetched. This book is kind of similar, and you'll soon see why. So we've actually got 3 separate book covers to discuss today, and the first one is the one that I have in my own personal collection, and it shows Nancy. She's kind of got the feathered, teased, strawberry blonde hair. She's wearing a navy blue hoodie, and she's got binoculars, and she's looking out at these boats. There's like a huge, almost looks like a military style boat, and then a little yacht. It's giving me Cold War vibes. I don't know why, but then the second cover edition, we have Nancy kind of on her knees in the foreground. She's wearing this awesome looking khaki jumpsuit, and her sleeve is ripped off, and what's behind her is, I believe this is the plane that she flies at one point in the book, but it's got a weird emblem on it. I believe it's supposed to be a vulture. And this book does have a tagline on this cover. It says, "The next time Nancy may get more than a warning." And the third and final cover edition, this one looks more 90s to me. Nancy's got these high-waisted cargo shorts on and a red t-shirt. She's kind of got more of the hairstyle that you would see in the 90s. It's more blonde here. And there's this huge vulture in the right corner of the book that's just kind of swooping towards her. It's kind of scary. And the tagline on this book cover is, "A shadow of evil swoops down on Nancy Drew." So I came up with a funny cover spoof using that first book cover where Nancy has the binoculars and she's watching the boats, and I said, so that's what the Joneses have been up to. And then I also came up with a funny cover spoof for the cover where Nancy has that vulture swooping down towards her, and I said, when you bring a sandwich to the beach. Have you guys ever had that happen where a seagull just like steals your lunch? Because I have, and it's not fun. So when it comes to giving these book covers a rating, I would give them a 3 magnifying glass rating, except maybe for the last one. That one's not my favorite, but I have to say the one with Nancy in the khaki uniform uniform. I would give that one 4 magnifying glasses. I think that one just looks really, really cool. Also, if you're like, Avery, I want to know what these book covers look like because I'm having trouble picturing them, I always post these on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays before these episodes come out on Thursday. So now I'll go ahead and read the cast of characters that we see in the Sinister Omen. So first up, we have Senor Ricardo Segovia, who is Carson Drew's client, Andre, who is his chauffeur, Consuelo, who is his housekeeper, and there's a man named Albert, who is Senor Segovia's bodyguard. There's also an elderly woman named Eleanor Palmer, and she has a secretary named Susan McAfee. There is Edward, Errol, and Odette, who are Miss Palmer's servants. There's Fred Blaine, an ex-news anchor, and he has 2 sons named Robert and Edward. There's Linda Blaine, his wife, Otto Stroessner, who's a head of a crime syndicate, Brian McConnell, who's his right-hand man, and Angus Campbell, and I just put busybody next to his name. So now I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis for The Sinister Omen. While Nancy and her friends from River Heights are enjoying spring vacation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the young detective is approached by a wealthy elderly woman who asks for her help. Her house has been burglarized frequently, but the would-be thieves only ransack the home. Nothing is ever taken. As Nancy sets off to find the culprits, she must also take on another assignment. An international ring of stamp forgers and smugglers are discovered in southern Florida, and Nancy must find a way to stop them. So yeah, now you kind of see what I mean. We're dealing with stamp smugglers and people who are making fake stamps. It seems a little bit far-fetched. Now for a quick and dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Stamping out crime. Nancy Drew rounds up stamp thieving ring in Florida. Alright, so now let's go ahead and jump into the direct quotes and notes that I wrote down for this book. So our story starts with a sleepover at Bess's house, and Bess and George wake up to a thud, and they see Nancy has fallen on the floor and is having a full-blown nightmare. And George tells Bess to wake Nancy up because she's thrashing around and almost running in her sleep, like on her side. She's like sprinting, it looks like, while she's laying on the floor, but Bess says she read somewhere that you should never wake someone who's having a nightmare because their heart could stop. I've never heard this before. I've only heard not to wake sleepwalkers because they can become combative with you. So George gets exasperated and says Nancy doesn't have heart problems and goes to wake her up herself. And Nancy wakes up and realizes that it was just a bad dream. And George blames it on the junk food they ate before going to sleep. You know, I think there is something to that though, because I've had something like to eat before I've gone to bed, and then I've had the weirdest dreams. So Bess asks what the nightmare was about, and Nancy says she dreamed she was chasing stamp smugglers on their spring vacation in Fort Lauderdale, which they're going on soon. Which, you know, that's very specific to have a dream like that. Like, who does that? Like, oh, what was your nightmare about? Oh, well, I was chasing these people that were accused of money laundering, you know. What happened to the standard, like, falling down the stairs nightmare? So Bess is upset about the prospect of another mystery, and Nancy explains it's really her dad's case that he's solving for a client, and his name is Senor Ricardo Segovia, who they just so happen to be staying with at his 22-room mansion. There's a lot of just interesting details, like 22 rooms, that's very specific, and man, that house is huge. So Nancy explains that Senor Ricardo often helps the US government, and there's been a group stealing rare stamps. I guess they're on the CIA's, you know, watch list or something. But Nancy also says that in the nightmare she was being chased by cars, boats, helicopters, and dogs, and some kind of bird, and she describes it as a bird of prey that eats carrions or dead bodies, which gross, but she says it's like a vulture. And Bess thinks that's disgusting, which I'm right there with her, and George jokes that being chased by an Emerson College senior in a gorilla suit would have been scarier. I don't know in what lifetime that would be a scenario that you would likely encounter, but yeah, I guess that would be scary, George. So the girls are about to go back to sleep, but Nancy says that it's 5 a.m. already, and they had stayed at Bess's to ride together to Florida in the morning. So she's like, it's pretty much already morning, we may as well just stay up. And suddenly they hear a car horn and look down to see Ned, Bert, and Dave in the driveway. So I took note of this because I think I talked about this in The Secret of the Forgotten City episode, but Dave is described as being blonde here again, and I think this is the first time I've seen that in a while because the guys, Bert and Dave, flip-flop from both being blonde to both being brunette to just one of them being blonde and the other brunette over the course of the series, and it's really strange. It's almost like because they're these side characters, the people ghostwriting these thought, nobody's gonna notice. It's just, they read the books out of order or whatever. Well, I noticed because, I'm reading them in order for this podcast, and I'm just kind of a stickler for details anyway, so yeah, I live for this stuff. So the guys are down there on the driveway heckling the girls for sleeping in, and then Bess's mom scolds them for waking up the entire neighborhood, and she then says she's packed them sandwiches and cookies for their drive to Florida. Thanks, Bess's mom. It's also funny because the guys are kind of taunting the girls and trash talking them, and they're like, we're gonna get to Florida first, we're gonna beat you down there. But then when they drive off, George laughs because they don't know that the girls are taking a plane. Yeah, we'll see who gets to Florida first. Enjoy that traffic. So Nancy, Bess, and George pack up to go to the airport, and a few blocks away from Bess's house, Nancy notices that they're being followed by a small green sports car. So Nancy outmaneuvers the car and does a U-turn, and they lose the person for a while, but then they're on their tail again. This girl, I swear, Nancy Drew gets followed by people more than I get followed on Instagram. So after a few more minutes into driving, Bess says, Nancy, if I tell you something, will you promise not to take your hands off the wheel and scream? And then George retorts, Nancy has never done that in her life. She's a safe driver. But Bess has noticed there's a second car following them, this time a yellow station wagon. Call me crazy, but I think the rule of thumb when you're following someone, not that I would have much experience with that, but my aunt was a private investigator. You don't want to be driving a car that's super conspicuous. This would be like following someone in a Tesla Cybertruck. People are gonna notice, maybe you should have opted for just a black sedan, Keep it simple. So they finally make it to the airport, and the station wagon pulls up next to them, and this woman gets out, and she introduces herself as Susan McAfee from Fort Lauderdale. Hey, what a coincidence. That's where we're going. So the book says she had the habit of many Southerners of ending a statement with a rising intonation to make it sound like a question. I'm from the South, and we don't do that. We don't uptalk and make things sound like a question, even though it's a statement. So I don't know what she's talking about. Oh gosh. So Miss McAfee says she knows Nancy is going to Florida and knows Carson, who is an old friend of her employer, Eleanor Palmer, and she asks to speak to Nancy privately, but she says anything she wants to say can be said to Bess and George. You know what? Good call on your part, Nancy, because if somebody was following me and then approached me at the airport and they're like, hey, I need to talk to you in private, no, I'm not going with that person. So Susan says okay, but asks to talk to them over sodas in the airport. So they go inside, sit down, and Susan explains that she is Eleanor Palmer's secretary and companion, and Eleanor is 93 years old and knew Carson's grandparents, whom Nancy comments had passed away before she was born. And Susan says that she, Eleanor, and Eleanor's servants live in an 1890s mansion, which keeps getting ransacked, and the vandals ransack the place but don't ever take anything. And so far it's happened 4 times, and Miss Palmer wants Nancy to take the case while she's in Florida, and Nancy asks why Susan flew all the way to River Heights if she knew Nancy was coming to Florida, and she says Miss Palmer wanted an answer right away, and she doesn't trust telephones or most things invented in the last 100 years. You know what? Fair enough, fair enough. You do you, boo. I don't trust AI, so here we are. So Nancy says she's really supposed to be on vacation when she goes to Florida, and Susan says Miss Palmer will pay any price, but Nancy says she never takes money. We all knew that Nancy was going to do that, right? Because that's her standard answer when people are like, oh, I'll pay you for your services. You're so good at solving mysteries. And then Nancy's like, no, I do this out of the kindness of my heart. I get abducted several times a week, but I do it for the love of the job. But it's funny here because Bess, who was previously like, I don't want to solve another mystery with you, Nancy, she suddenly reasons, well, it would be impolite to not help a family friend. And then George and Nancy are amused because Bess just doesn't like mysteries, but here she is like, well, we should probably help her. And then Nancy agrees to help. So next, Nancy, Bess, and George go to check in and see the seaplane that Carson has chartered for them, and the girls grab box lunches to take along. And so Nancy's going to fly them to Florida. I was thinking she was just gonna go commercial, get on, American Airlines or something, but no, she's flying her own plane. And I think it's so cool that the skills she picked up in the Sky Phantom is coming back into the series, because sometimes Nancy will do things like tap dance in Morse code, and then we never see her do that again, which that's kind of a weird skill to have anyway. But I like that they continue to show, she still has her pilot's license. So Nancy notices this airplane mechanic who avoids looking her in the eye, and he pulls a hat lower over his face out there on the tarmac, which she just thinks is odd. But the girls go up in the plane, and it's weird because it says they pass over New York. Which we're going to Fort Lauderdale, which, yes, is on the East Coast, but River Heights is in the Midwest, is what I was thinking. So maybe they're flying on a certain flight pattern. I don't know. But why wouldn't Nancy just go south, then cut over to the coast? I don't know. I don't fly a plane, so I may be missing something here. But they fly on and they eat their lunches, and Bess decides to take a nap. But near Charleston, the engine starts to splutter, and Nancy realizes they must be out of gas. But the gas gauge is saying that the tank is full, so Nancy's like, oh no, somebody must have meddled with it. My gas gauge has been broken in my car for some time now. I'm actually getting it fixed this weekend, but that's very annoying. It will say that it's like half full, and then I will run out of gas somewhere, and it's the best thing. But I cannot imagine being in a plane and that happening. That is terrifying to me. So Nancy radios down and is directed to land as close to one of the outer-lying islands as she can, and Nancy tells George to get a life vest on and help Bess with one and to pray. So poor Bess, she's still half asleep, and she asks, are we there yet? And then she wakes up in a panic because she doesn't hear the engine. And so Nancy manages to glide slowly down and land on the water with minimal impact, thankfully. Maybe Ned, Bert, and Dave had the right idea taking a car to Florida instead of flying a plane. So Nancy lands the plane, and then Bess asks if they're dead, and Nancy says, no, we're in South Carolina. That needs to be a slogan for the tourism board. Am I dead? No, you're just in South Carolina. Welcome to heaven. I actually really like South Carolina, the parts that I've seen. Beautiful state. Please don't come for me. So then all of a sudden Nancy shouts, Mr. Blaine, because what are the odds? An ex-news anchor friend of Carson's named Fred Blaine lives in South Carolina, and Nancy has just literally landed her plane in the water of his backyard. So he ushers them up to the house where his wife Linda feeds them cookies, and their sons Robert and Edward flirt with the girls. And the girls just survived an emergency seaplane landing. Like, I would not be flirting and eating cookies. I would probably have a nice lie down in fetal position. That's all I'm saying. So Mr. Blaine says Nancy's tank for her plane was empty, and Nancy thinks the suspicious airplane mechanic could have been the one to tamper with it. And he also asks Nancy, hey, what's up with that drawing of a vulture under the plane? And it's the vulture that looks like the one from Nancy's nightmare. Creepy. So the group all goes down to look at the plane, and they see the vulture drawing is a decal, so they peel it off. Also, while they're all talking, Mr. Blaine just kind of happens to mention that he had some stamps stolen. So Nancy, Bess, and George stay the night at the Blaine's house, and the next day, Edward says they should stop by on their return trip, giving George a longing look, and Robert blows a kiss to Nancy. It's such a trope in these books. I mean, the girls literally just almost had a near-death accident, but they're getting flirted with left and right. Like, Nancy, Bess, and George apparently can't go out in public without one of them getting advances from members of the opposite sex. So they get to flying the plane again because they've filled it up with gas, and Nancy references the revised text of Mystery of the Moss-Covered Mansion indirectly. So the book says they pass over Cape Canaveral, which reminded Nancy of another adventure where Bess and George were in a car accident and Bess almost got bit by an alligator. I love that they referenced a past mystery and something that Nancy, Bess, and George have bonded over, but can you just imagine that conversation? Nancy just looking down and being like, oh, there's Cape Canaveral. Hey, remember that time you guys got in a car accident and Bess, you almost got your hand hand ripped off by an alligator? Fun times. So the girls land at Fort Lauderdale Airport, and they're picked up by Senor Segovia's chauffeur named Andre, who seems troubled. And the girls get in his limousine, and Bess screams when she sees another vulture decal on the ceiling of the car. Andre peels it off, and he says someone must be playing a prank, but he looks uneasy about it. And Nancy tells him about their crash landing and the same symbol being on their plane, and Andre says he wants to tell Nancy something, but then he seems to think better of it. So when the girls get to the Segovia mansion, the 22-room mansion, Andre goes off and they meet the housekeeper, Consuelo, and the book says Nancy takes a bath with some black soap, something she'd never seen before, which I've never seen that before either, but she sits on the porch with a lemonade after freshening up. I wonder if it was Venus Beauty Soap, the soap that Nancy did the commercials for in the last book. So Senor Segovia shows up and he tells Nancy what Andre was too afraid to. Carson has been kidnapped, but not to worry, it's only been for a day, and Senor Segovia got a phone call from an informant working on the crime organization they're investigating, and that person told him where they could find Carson. Excuse me, what? I give you full permission to panic because, okay, if your dad has been kidnapped and someone says, oh, it's only been a day that he's been kidnapped. Like, no, you have my full permission to panic. That is very scary. So Nancy and Senor Segovia go to a warehouse district and meet some plainclothes detectives and bust down a warehouse door, but Carson isn't there. And Nancy sees the letter D written on a carton, and she knows that it's a sign that her dad was there. And the carton that the letter D is on says Belfont. So Senor Segovia stays to work with the police, and Nancy starts to drive back to his house, but she gets the idea that Belfont may be a hotel, and it may be an abandoned one where this group, who buys out merchandise from failing businesses, could be operating out of, and that could be where they're holding Carson. That's a pretty sound theory. So Nancy stops at a restaurant and calls the police to try and get a hold of Senor Segovia, but he's not there, so she asks if there is a Belfont hotel nearby, and sure enough there was, and it's now abandoned. So Nancy gets the address and drives there, and it's in this rundown area and all the windows and doors are boarded up, but Nancy thinks Carson might be inside. So Nancy decides to pry up these loose floorboards on this rotten porch and slip under it, but we get Nancy actually being mean to herself here. She says, if only I had dieted a little more the night before we left River Heights instead of eating all that pizza and ice cream. Okay, I was shocked that Nancy did this. I was like, no, that's not okay, but also like one night is not gonna make that much of a difference. I don't know. I think that Nancy Drew is such a role model in other ways, so it's kind of unfortunate when we see things like this in the books. So Nancy drops down into the dirtiest cellar she's ever seen, and she says Hannah would have a field day cleaning it. I love that. But it's so gross because Nancy finds herself in the middle of a rat's nest, and I would have screamed. I would have alerted the villains like, oh, she's here. So Nancy finally goes up a few floors and she sees a crack of light under a door and hears voices, and she sees her dad tied to a chair and his two captors, but before she can do anything, she gets seized from behind and pushed into the room. So Nancy gets tied up alongside Carson and begs the bad guys to take out his gag, but they won't. And she also bluffs and says the police will be there soon and the men should let them go because the punishment for kidnapping is life imprisonment. I don't think this is true in the justice system because I feel like people get off for good behavior, like their sentences are always lessened, but good bluff. So the men just laugh at Nancy, and one of them says they know Nancy came alone. And then he says, we've been studying you and your father, you see. We've studied you very closely. Then another guy says the Brotherhood of the Vulture has checked them out before the third man tells him to shut up. There's that vulture reference, so something tells me they have decals for their little club. I wonder if they make t-shirts. So Nancy continues saying they'll go to jail, and she's working especially hard on spooking one of the men who seems to be the weakest link, and he gets scared and gives up one man's name, which is Pedro, and another who isn't there. I think this is when they reference Brian McConnell. And Nancy warns them they don't have much time until the police show up when there's a crash downstairs. And Nancy figures that the rats have probably knocked something over, but it's all the opening she needs. So the guys bolt off, and Nancy is able to untie her loose bonds and free Carson too. So the Drews get out of the abandoned hotel, and Carson makes Nancy promise she'll never do something like that without telling the police first, for real. And I'm sure she won't, but it's the thought that counts. So Nancy and Carson go back to the Segovia mansion where Senor Segovia is excited to see them, and he sits them down and explains the finer details of the case, and he says the crime ring has actually sued him. And Nancy says it's to keep him tied up with legal matters so he can't investigate them. And Senor Segovia says a man named Otto Stroessner runs this crime syndicate, and he's bald and has a monocle, and he sounds like the Monopoly man to me. And it turns out that his right-hand man is a man named Brian McConnell. So this crime syndicate steals and counterfeits stamps, and like, I get it, stamps can be valuable sometimes, but anything can be to the right collector, but really? Stamps? So after everyone talks, Nancy gets a call from Miss Palmer, who is kind of rude to her. She asks Nancy what kind of detective Nancy is and says she's been in Fort Lauderdale long enough to contact her. And Nancy is like, hello, my dad was kidnapped. And then Miss Palmer has the nerve to say that if Nancy was really a good detective, she would have prevented Carson's kidnapping. Wow, I don't like this lady. So she tells Nancy she wants to see her at 7 a.m. the next morning, and Carson tells Nancy she'll like her once she gets to know her. Yeah, I'm sure she's a great lady. Like, if somebody said to me, look, I know you've been through something super traumatic, but you could have prevented it, I think I would slap them. That's called victim blaming, and we don't do that here. So Nancy wakes up to laughter down at the pool the next morning, and she sees Bess and George and the guys, so they've finally made it to Florida, and she realizes she's overslept and it's 10 a.m. So Nancy panics, but Carson says he called Miss Palmer to explain and said Nancy would be over a little bit later. And wait a minute, that woman was supposed to hate telephones. I guess she got over it. So Nancy talks to Ned for a minute, and he relays that they got stuck in New Jersey. And again, I was like, if they're coming from River Heights, this is super confusing to me. Like, I'm beginning to see why people make an argument for Nancy being from New York, but she's still from the Midwest to me. So next, Nancy finds out from Senor Segovia that this Brotherhood of the Vulture was formed in Latin America. And then after they're done talking, the guys, Ned, Bert, and Dave, go out on a yacht. So while they're doing that, Nancy, Bess, and George go to see Miss Palmer, and they take a pale blue limousine instead of a gray one this time, because apparently Senor Segovia has a rainbow-like entourage of limousines at his disposal. Can you imagine having that much money, just being like, you know what, I think on Tuesday I'm gonna take the pale blue limousine out and run my errands. Also, he has a yacht, because that's what Ned, Bert, and Dave are out on. So when they get to Miss Palmer, she gets straight to the point, and she says the robberies have all happened at night and she hasn't been at home. And so Nancy asks about her servants, Errol the butler, Edward the gardener, and Odette the maid. And Errol actually chased the robbers away the first time they came and fell, so they got away. And Edward was away on a trip. So Nancy asks if any of them have ever been arrested, and Odette, according to Miss Palmer, got mad at a pushy aluminum pot salesman who wouldn't leave and nearly beat him to death with them. Look, I don't like door-to-door salespeople as much as the next person, but I don't think I would try to beat them with their own product. Like, here they are trying to make a living, and they're like, oh, you'll love these aluminum pots. They're non-stick. They're great. And then the customer is like, hey, can you come here? I want to see how good these are to use as a weapon. That is not okay. But Miss Palmer says she trusts her servants. And, you know, this whole time I've been saying servants, but that sounds so antiquated. Like, staff would have been much better, or you know, I mean, even help doesn't sound really good to me, but that's what the book calls them, servants. So when Nancy is getting ready to leave, she sees a man's shoes poking out from under a curtain, and she wonders if it's someone that's been eavesdropping, but it turns out to just be Errol, the butler, and he's been dusting. So Nancy, Bess, George, Ned, Dave, and Bert go to Fort Lauderdale Beach, and they grab dinner that night. And there's a huge crowd of spring breakers, and Nancy notices someone following them and asks asks him point blank why he is, and he says his name is Albert and he's a bodyguard of Senor Segovia's. And he says that he was told to keep an eye out for them. And at first I was suspicious of this. I was like, this guy could be saying he's the bodyguard and he's really not, but it turns out he is. And I mean, the guy that employed him, I mean, he has several different colored limos, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that he would have a bodyguard. And it's a good thing that he was told to watch out for the group, because they're eating their food in an alley, which I don't know why they do this. I think they get food from a food truck or something, when someone, Albert, yells a warning to watch out, and this truck comes barreling towards them. So everybody manages to get out of the way in time, but their food goes all over the place and all over them. And Albert comes down the alley and warns them that Stroessner's group may be trying to intimidate them. And so they also find a buzzard sticker on the back of Nancy's shirt, so somebody in the crowd must have placed it on her back. So everyone walks away unharmed other than being covered in their own food, but Nancy and Ned still feel like they're being followed by someone other than their bodyguard on the way to this ice cream parlor, so they duck into a restaurant to hide. And they're near a private room and they overhear someone talking about penny black, the most expensive stamp in the world, and stamp machines. So it's the stamp counterfeiters. They must get together at the local Chili's every Wednesday to discuss their nefarious activities. So Nancy hears Otto Stroessner's name and she knows he's on the other side of the door. And about that time, a guy from the restaurant yells and tells them they're closed and they shouldn't be there, which alerts the bad guys and they get away. So Ned and Albert, the bodyguard, get in a fist fight with the restaurant guy, two of them, and Nancy runs out the door and gets the license number on Stroessner's car before it pulls away. But just before this, Nancy discovered her wallet is gone, so she was probably pickpocketed when that sticker was put on her back. Now, the next day, Nancy gives the license plate number to Senor Segovia and her dad to investigate, and then she calls Miss Palmer. And Nancy wants Miss Palmer to get all her servants to leave except for Errol, and she wants to hide upstairs to see if maybe they will attempt another robbery, the thieves. So she thinks the burglars will be tempted because the house will be empty, and Miss Palmer agrees to it. So later, Nancy and her friends are in the pool at the Segovia mansion when this boat called the Flying Scot pulls up, and it's captained by this guy named Angus Campbell, who claims to be a neighbor of Senor Segovia. And it's kind of weird because Nancy calls him handsome several times in her head, and the book says there was something unusual about him and she couldn't put it into words, but it was a feeling of danger that was at once attractive and frightening. Nancy, Ned is right next to you in the pool, like, why are you thinking these thoughts? But Angus flirts with Bess, and Dave notices, and he is not happy about it. But Angus is kind of a busybody. He's really just kind of trying to pump them for information, and he asks about Carson and the case he's solving, and Nancy is just instantly suspicious of him. And Angus also points out another Brotherhood of the Vulture mark on the Segovia dock. So after this, Angus invites everyone in the group on his yacht, and so they all go, and Nancy notices that two crewmen are super rude and they don't talk to the group, and Bess and Angus dance, and Dave gets really jealous. This guy is just a problem. He needs to leave. So while everyone's busy dancing and hanging out on the yacht, Nancy looks around on the ship and she feels like the crew are following her, like they don't want her to be left alone to her own devices. So she ducks into a bathroom and finds a magazine that's in Spanish, even though the crew speaks French. And there's an article about some stamps being stolen in the Caribbean in the magazine. So Nancy asks Angus about it and he plays dumb, and he also lies and says he hasn't taken out his yacht, but Dave says the boat wasn't at the dock the other day when they went out on Senor Segovia's yacht. I don't know, the magazine thing is not that suspicious to me. Like, maybe the crew speaks Spanish and French, and it could just be one of those throwaway magazines, you know, like people have in their bathroom. It's like having a coffee table book. Like, do you actually read it or do you just put it out to impress people? So next, when they get back from their yacht ride, Nancy goes to Miss Palmer's for the stakeout dressed as Susan McAfee to confuse anyone that may be watching the house. And when Susan later leaves, they will think the house is empty except for Errol. So Nancy has also told the police her plan, and she hides upstairs, and Miss Palmer and Miss McAfee eventually leave, and Errol lets two guys in a few hours later. So the butler butler is the one who done it. He's an inside man. So Nancy goes to call the police, but the line is dead. So someone has probably disconnected it, and she then sneaks downstairs and sees the burglars ripping apart upholstery in search of something. So Nancy tries to go out the front door, but it's locked. And she decides to go back upstairs where she can hide and where she knows she left a window open, and runs straight into one of the robbers. So Nancy screams for help and runs upstairs, locking the bedroom door and shoving a dresser in front of it. And while the guy is trying to bust into the room, Nancy climbs on the roof and yells for help to all the neighboring houses nearby, and a passing motorist hears her. So she tells them to call the police, and about that time, sirens can be heard. So the burglars, who have busted the bedroom door open, now run downstairs and flee. And when Nancy gets downstairs, she sees Errol is tied up and he asks for help, but Nancy says she knows he was in on the job, and he asks for a glass of water, and Nancy, being nice, gets him one. But then when Nancy turns around with the glass of water, she sees that Errol is untied, and he says, "It was your misfortune to get in my way, Miss Drew. But you see, it's not too late for me. Obviously, I can't let you tell the police, can I?" And he grabs Nancy's throat. But then Errol suddenly has like a change of heart, and he says he can't hurt her, and he takes off. So Nancy lets the police in and gives them the description of the burglars. Now, when Susan and Miss Palmer return, Nancy is reluctant to let the older woman see the damage that the robbers have done to the house, and Miss Palmer is upset about her ruined rugs and furniture, but not overly so. She's more upset when she finds out her butler was in on it, which is understandable. And she also says she wishes Nancy hadn't let them get away, and is frustrated she doesn't know what they're after. But Susan reminds her that Nancy has only been on the job for 2 days. 2 days. Like, a lot has happened in 2 days, and Miss Palmer is kind of like the definition of a needy employer to me. And it's like, you're not even paying Nancy. I know Nancy said she didn't want payment, but still. So Bert and George show up with some news at this point, and they were all down at the beach, and Ned stopped to tie his shoe by a payphone, and he happened to overhear a guy talking to Otto Stroessner, and he said a fast boat will pull into Port Everglades with valuable cargo. So Ned has rented a boat for them to take to investigate. So Nancy and Ned next go on this stakeout in the boat that they rented, and they watch the port, and they see a smaller boat going up to a larger one. And Nancy tells Ned to call the police, but instead he accidentally hits a switch that turns on a searchlight and siren. Smooth. But they do see suitcases being passed from the boats before they take off, and the couple pursues them using a radio to call the police, but the boats do get away. So Ned is upset about screwing this up, and Nancy says it's okay, but when they get back to the dock, Ned trips and falls getting off the boat, and he says, "I'm done for the day." And he's basically going back to his room before he can screw anything else up. And I was like, if this is not me, because I've had days like that where I'm like, I seem to not be able to do anything right, and I'm always like, okay, I'm going home now. I'm just gonna go home now. So Senor Segovia tells Nancy that he investigated the license plate number that she got off the car that Otto Stroessner got away in, and it belongs to Errol Bigley, Miss Palmer's butler. And Nancy also makes the connection that he's working with the Stroessner people because she overheard the name Bigley at the restaurant the other night. So after this, Nancy and Ned go back to Miss Palmer's and ask her if she has a safe or a safety deposit box, and she shows them a safe that's cleverly hidden in the fireplace hearth, but she still doesn't know what the thieves are after. And she's forgotten the combination to the safe, so a locksmith has to come. And there's a bunch of old love letters between her grandparents in the safe, and Nancy realizes that the thieves are after the stamps on the letters, not the letters themselves, because they're older stamps and they're pretty valuable. So Nancy says she'll take them to Senor Segovia to authenticate them. So after they leave the Palmer mansion, Nancy and Ned catch a taxi not far from Miss Palmer's, and what do you know, the taxi driver is a bad guy. And so he takes them and the stamps straight to Stroessner. And Nancy threatens to set the letters on fire in the back of the taxi, and she rips some of the stamps to get the guy to pull over. And she then gives him some fake envelopes so she and Ned can escape with the real letters. Very smart. So when they get back to Senor Segovia's mansion, they find out that he and Carson are in Miami on a tip, and it's probably a fake one that was placed by Otto Stroessner. But meanwhile, across the canal, Angus Campbell, the guy who came by claiming to be a neighbor, is loading a counterfeit stamp press and other things into a truck. So the stamp thieves' headquarters has been in plain sight across the bay the entire time. So Nancy and the group get Albert, the bodyguard, to take them over there in the limousine, and he's also an ex-stuntman. Like, what do we not know about this guy? So he has them get out, and he speeds the limo up the Campbell's driveway, turns it quickly so it flips on its side, and he busts into the gate. So now the crooks are blocked in. But then these stamp counterfeiters bring a bulldozer out and they smash the limo out of the way because apparently they have all these resources. They have a bulldozer at their disposal. So the group chases the crime ring to the airport while Nancy calls the police frantically, who say they're on their way. So the bad guys are loading up all their counterfeit stuff on a plane and they're literally taxiing down the runway when a sinkhole swallows their plane. I was not expecting this. That kind of came out of nowhere. But the police show up and arrest them, and Stroessner, Angus, Errol, all of them get taken to jail. But as they're getting put in handcuffs, Angus flirts with Bess and says, "I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to know each other better," which makes Dave really mad. And then the story ends with the crime ring in jail and Miss Palmer donating the proceeds from the stamps to a charity. So now let's go ahead to a segment of the podcast that I like to call What's Cooking. So in this book, we had mentionings of pepperoni pizza, pistachio ice cream, sandwiches and cookies, spare ribs, hamburgers, and Cokes. Now for the things that I think Nancy could add to her resume. So I said that Nancy could be a seaplane pilot. I mean, she did run out of gas, but that wasn't her entire fault. But she's a very good plane pilot. Now let's talk about the things I liked and didn't like about the Sinister Omen. So the things I liked, this mystery made a lot of sense. It flowed really well, but the things I didn't like, the stamps were kind of far-fetched, I thought. I know stamps are worth a lot of money, but the mystery itself was kind of boring. So if I had to give this book an overall magnifying glass rating, I would probably give it a 3 to 3.5. I mean, the whole sinkhole thing, the plane going into a sinkhole, that was not on the Nancy Drew bingo card for me. I was not expecting that, but it was just not my favorite book. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the next book in the series, The Elusive Heiress. And if you like rodeos and missing persons, you're definitely not going to want to miss this episode. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.